We have just seen how to visualize computers, virtual machines, and containers connected to the fabric. Now, let's see how we can analyze the location and the network connectivity history of all endpoints across one or multiple sites. EndPoint Locator relies on the in-band management network of the fabric to collect the endpoint information using MPBGP EVPN to communicate with the route reflector. A very important point here is that for these particular functions, EPL, NDFC service uses the data interfaces of the network dashboard cluster. A slight clarification of what we call an endpoint in the context of VXLAN EVPN. Any object accessible from the fabric using its layer 3 and or layer 2 reachability information is known as an endpoint. When connected to a VXLAN EVPN fabric, an endpoint is learned by its first hop node, or the ingress VTEP if you will, which redistributes its reachability information via the route reflector toward all other leaf nodes of interest. NDFC embeds a function called EPL, Endpoint Locator. This feature allows real-time tracking of all endpoints within a fabric or across multiple fabrics, and NDFC will provision the spine node where the route reflector is initiated. It will automatically configure the route reflector to establish the connectivity between the route reflector for the in-band management network and the reachability information of the external IP address allocated for the EPL under the Nexus Dashboard Cluster data interface settings. You can visualize the active endpoint locator inventory within the fabric from the dashboard menu. From there, you can get a summary of the active VRF, active networks, dual attach endpoints, or single attach endpoints. And you can view the inventory over a timeline from where you can see when new endpoints have been added or removed from the fabric. Now from the dashboard window, you can also see the list of active endpoints with their respective identifier, the network, the VRF they belong to, the parent leaf nodes with the associated interface. And when you select an endpoint from this list, you get further details, including its life over a timeline that display the life of a particular endpoint in its entire existence within the fabric. In this example, the orange line shows for how long the endpoint is active, and in gray when it was active in the past and when it was disconnected from the fabric. A demo is traditionally more visual and efficient than a series of snapshots. The endpoint locator functions, or EPL, can be enabled per VXLAN EVPN fabric. In this use case, you will enable the endpoint locator for both fabrics that belong to a multi-site domain. The first action is to configure a routed interface from one leaf node to allow communication between the NDFC data interface and the in-band management in order to communicate with the route reflector, hence to get all endpoint details. Edit the interface of interest, and you can select the EPL interface template policy. Add the IP address and net mask and deploy. You can preview the details of the configuration pushed toward the leaf node. When the access to the in-band management is operational, you can configure the endpoint locator at the fabric level. This is quite easy. Just check Configure My Fabric and confirm the route reflectors. You can also collect the MAC addresses of endpoints if you wish, save the config, and that's all you need to do. That action takes almost 1 minute or so. When done, a success notification appears. You can now recalculate and deploy the configuration. You can preview the configuration pushed toward the spine devices. Notice the new BGP neighbors .8.10, which is one of the IP address consumed from the pool of data service configured in the Nexus Dashboard external service pool. You can repeat the EPL configuration for the fabric too. This time the BGP neighbor for the root reflector in Fabric 2 is .8.11 that you can retrieve from the Nexus dashboard external service configurations. As you noticed, there is one IP address per fabric. When done, after a few minutes, you can look at the dashboard menu under the EndPoint Locator tab, where you can see a summary of all endpoints across all your fabric controller. You can select a particular fabric, Fabric 1 for example, with 13 active endpoints, and Fabric 2 with 11 active endpoints. If you wish, you can view all active endpoints across the multi-site domain. You can select one endpoint identifier from Fabric 2 and look at its life history. If one endpoint has been off during a certain period of time, you will see the disconnected time here. From the dashboard, you can get a summary of the active VRF, active networks, dual attach endpoint, or single attach endpoint. You can expand any of the tiles to get the history of any active endpoints, networks, or VRF. You can change the time range to retrieve a particular period of time. As you can see, on March 10th, we moved from 18 active endpoints to 24 endpoints. If you change the scope to a single fabric, you can take a snapshot and compare endpoint data at two specific points in time. By default, it compares the collected data during the previous hour. If you wish to compare endpoint snapshots at other points in time, select the 2 points in time, say T1 and T2, and apply the changes. From each Fabric topology view where EndPoint Locator is enabled, you can select the detailed view, and from the detailed view, you can explore the Virtual Infrastructure tab and get all the details for each active endpoint known for that EasyFabric.